Some stories are meant to be forgotten, buried deep under years of lies and secrets. But what if the past refuses to stay hidden? What if a simple act of kindness, a little girl handing $1 to a homeless man, sets off a chain of events that no one saw coming? A man who lost everything, a girl who doesn't know who she really is, a family built on deception, and a truth so shocking, it will change everything. As the pieces start to fall into place, one question remains. Can the past be rewritten, or is it too late to fix what was broken? Stay until the end to uncover the truth. And don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The evening air was crisp, a light breeze carrying the distant sound of city traffic. Emma clutched her grandfather's hand as they walked down the bustling sidewalk, the rhythmic tapping of her polished ballet flats barely audible over the hum of the streets. The scent of fresh bread and coffee drifted from a nearby cafe, mingling with the sharpness of the autumn air. She had just finished her ballet class, her pink tutu peeking out from beneath her wool coat. Her grandfather, William Anderson, a man of quiet authority and old money, walked beside her with an air of silent contemplation. "Grandpa, can I give him something?" Emma's voice was small, hesitant, yet filled with an earnest kindness as she pointed towards a homeless man sitting on the corner, his tattered jacket pulled tightly around his frail frame. His face was weathered, lined with years of hardship, his tired blue eyes staring vacantly at the pavement. William hesitated, his grip on Emma's hand tightening slightly, but then he nodded. "Of course, darling," he said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a crisp $1 bill. Emma, however, took the bill and, with a small giggle, pulled out a pen from her tiny purse. She carefully sketched a little face in the corner of the bill, a habit she had, drawing little smiling faces on random objects. Satisfied with her work, she skipped over to the man and placed the bill in his outstretched palm. "Here, mister. I gave him a little smile so he can keep you company," she said sweetly before turning back to William. The man didn't react at first. He simply stared at the bill in his hands, his fingers trembling. Then his breath hitched, his chest rose sharply, and his entire body stiffened. The face, it wasn't just any drawing. It was the drawing, her drawing. Michael Carter felt like the earth had cracked beneath him. His mind struggled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. His hands gripped the dollar so tightly his knuckles turned white, his pulse hammering in his ears. This was impossible. This was... Wait! His voice came out hoarse, broken from years of disuse. He tried to push himself up, his body weak from hunger and exhaustion. But by the time he looked up, the girl was already walking away, her small figure disappearing into the crowd, her delicate laughter fading into the city's noise. Michael's breath came in short, desperate gasps. He turned the bill over, inspecting every inch of it, his mind racing. He had to be imagining it. There was no way, no possible way, but the evidence was right there in his hand. His vision blurred as old memories clawed their way back to the surface, memories he had spent years trying to suppress. His daughter, Emily. She used to draw that exact same little face on his arms, his notebooks, even on napkins at restaurants when she was barely 4 years old. It was their little thing, a silent way of saying, "I love you," without words. And now, out of nowhere, a child had handed him a bill with the same exact drawing. Michael's heart pounded so violently it hurt. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to pull him back down. He had to find her. He had to know who she was. Was it possible? Could she be? But as he turned to chase after her, his knees buckled beneath him. The world spun violently, and he crashed to the ground, his vision going black. The last thing he saw was the little face on the dollar staring back at him. "Are you all right, Grandpa?" Emma asked as they stepped into the car, her voice laced with concern. William hadn't spoken since they left the street corner. His usually composed face was pale, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Yes, darling," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But he wasn't tired. He was shaken. The moment Emma had handed that bill to the homeless man, something inside him had twisted painfully. He had seen the way the man reacted, the way his entire body seemed to break apart in that single moment. And worse, he recognized something familiar in the man's eyes, a familiarity he never should have seen. As he drove through the city streets, memories he had tried to suppress clawed their way to the surface, ones he had spent years burying beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. He stole a glance at Emma in the rearview mirror, her bright eyes staring curiously out the window, completely unaware of the storm she had just unknowingly set into motion. He gritted his teeth. He had spent years making sure that this would never happen, that their lives would remain untouched by the ghosts of the past, that Emma would never have to know. But now it seemed fate had other plans. Michael woke up to the sound of distant sirens and the cold pavement beneath him. His entire body ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the storm raging inside his chest. He clutched the dollar in his fist as he forced himself to sit up. The girl was gone. He had no name, no lead, no way of knowing who she was. But he wasn't going to let that stop him, because something deep inside him told him, no, screamed at him, that this wasn't a coincidence. He had spent years trying to forget, trying to move on from the life he had lost. He had given up hope of ever finding his daughter. But now, after all this time, a little girl had unknowingly given him the first real clue he'd had in years, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. With renewed determination, Michael rose to his feet. He would find out who she was. He would follow every lead, every shadow, every fragment of the past until he uncovered the truth. Because for the first time in a decade, he had hope, and he wasn't about to lose it again. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, cars honking in the distance, the murmur of voices blending into the urban symphony of life. Michael Carter sat hunched on a bench at the edge of a dimly lit park, the dollar bill still clenched in his hand. He traced the little drawn face with his thumb, his breath shallow, his mind restless. A part of him wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that he was imagining things. But deep down, in the places untouched by logic, he knew. This was not just a random act of kindness from a child. This was a message from fate, a sign that the past had not been erased as he had once believed. He needed to find her. The problem was, he had nothing to go on. No name, no address, no connection. Just the image of a little girl in a pink tutu and a wealthy-looking old man leading her away. He pressed his fingers against his temples, frustration bubbling beneath his skin. Years of wandering had turned him into a ghost, a man who no longer belonged anywhere, whose past was a collection of shattered memories. But if she was connected to Emily, then he had to find a way to uncover the truth. A sudden gust of wind carried laughter from a nearby playground. Michael looked up, his gaze locking onto the sight of young children running freely, their parents watching from the benches. His heart clenched at the sight. Once he had been one of those parents. Once he had held his little girl's hand, carried her on his shoulders, tucked her into bed with whispered lullabies. But that was another life, one that had slipped through his fingers like sand. He stood abruptly. He needed a plan. The first step was retracing his own past, finding the loose threads that might lead him back to the life he had lost. He didn't believe in miracles, but today he had been given something close to one. He wasn't going to waste it. Emma sat curled up on the leather couch in her grandfather's study, a book resting on her lap, but her attention wandered. She glanced toward William, who sat behind his massive oak desk, staring at a glass of bourbon he had barely touched. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words. Emma sensed something was wrong, but she didn't know what. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you've been quiet all evening." William blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. He turned his gaze to her and forced a smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But Emma wasn't convinced. There was something different about him, something unsettled beneath his usually composed demeanor. "Was it about the man today?" she asked. "The one I gave the dollar to?" William stiffened ever so slightly, but it was enough for her to notice. She watched as he took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "No, darling. It's just been a long day." Emma frowned. He looked really sad, like he recognized something when he saw the dollar. William exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. Sometimes, people who have lost everything hold on to the smallest things as if they were lifelines. He set the glass down and leaned forward. You have a kind heart, Emma, but there are things in this world you're too young to understand. Emma tilted her head. Like what? Like the past, William said quietly. Sometimes, it's better left where it belongs. Emma wasn't sure why, but a shiver ran down her spine. Michael spent the night in a rundown shelter on the outskirts of town, sleep eluding him. He kept going over the same thoughts, the same questions. Why had she drawn that face? Who had taught her to do it? And why did the man with her grandfather, maybe, look so familiar? By morning, he had made a decision. If he couldn't find the girl directly, he had to start by looking into his own past. Someone had gone through great lengths to erase him, to make sure he stayed lost. That meant someone had answers, and it was time he found them. His first stop was the library, not because he expected to find anything there, but because it was one of the few places he could access a computer without drawing attention. He logged into an old email account he hadn't used in years. Surprisingly, it still worked. As he scrolled through past emails, his fingers hovered over a name that made his breath hitch. Daniel Carter, his brother, the last person who had tried to help him before he disappeared into the cracks of society. He hesitated, then quickly typed out a message. Daniel, I don't know if this will reach you. I don't even know if you care anymore, but I need your help. Something happened. I think I found a piece of my past. If you're willing to talk, meet me at Roosevelt Park at 5 p.m. If you don't show up, I'll understand. But please, if there's anything left of the brother I once knew, just give me a chance. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. William paced the length of his office, fingers twitching as he debated his next move. The moment he saw that man on the street, something inside him had cracked. He had known this day would come eventually. He had spent years preparing for it, ensuring that the past remained buried. And yet, a child's innocent gesture had undone everything. He opened a locked drawer and pulled out an old envelope, its edges worn from years of handling. He stared at it for a long time before carefully opening it. Inside were two things, a photograph and a letter. The photograph was of a man holding a little girl in his arms, both of them laughing, their eyes full of love. The man had messy brown hair and a wide, carefree smile. The girl had her arms wrapped around his neck, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt. Michael Carter and his daughter, Emily. William ran a hand down his face. He had told himself he had done the right thing, that what he had done had been necessary. But now, as he looked at the picture, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a stone. He unfolded the letter, the handwriting familiar and shaky. If anything happens to me, please take care of her. Please, William. You're the only one I can trust. The words burned into his mind as they always did. But now, for the first time in years, he questioned them. He had taken care of her. He had given her a life of safety, of privilege. He had erased the painful past to protect her. But had he done the right thing? He wasn't sure anymore. Michael waited at Roosevelt Park, his nerves frayed, his pulse unsteady. He half expected Daniel to ignore the email, to pretend he never saw it. But at exactly 5 p.m., a familiar voice spoke behind him. You look like hell, Mike. Michael turned sharply, his breath catching. His brother stood a few feet away, older, wearier, but unmistakably him. Daniel, Michael said, his voice thick. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You said you found something. What is it? Michael pulled out the dollar, unfolding it carefully. He held it up so Daniel could see the little drawn face. Daniel frowned. What am I looking at? Michael's voice trembled as he spoke. Emily used to draw this exact face, over and over, on everything. Daniel's expression changed instantly. His face paled, his jaw tightening. Mike! He hesitated. You need to let this go. Michael's heart pounded. What do you know, Daniel? Daniel shook his head, looking away. It's not that simple. Michael's blood ran cold. His brother knew something, and he was hiding it. Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears as he stared at his brother. The weight of Daniel's words hung thick in the air between them, suffocating. "You need to let this go." It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of something deeper, something hidden beneath years of silence and secrets. Michael took a step closer, his eyes burning with desperation. "Daniel, don't do this. I know that look. You know something. And I swear to God, if you don't tell me what it is." "Or what, Mike?" Daniel cut him off, his voice sharp but weary. "What are you gonna do? You gonna yell at me? Demand answers." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? Some things aren't meant to be dug up." Michael's chest tightened, his grip on the crumpled dollar bill still firm. "You think I have a choice? You think I can just forget this? After everything I lost, after everything that was taken from me? Can't walk away, Daniel. Not now. Not when I'm this close." Daniel exhaled heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked like he was at war with himself, as if there was something clawing to get out, but he was too afraid to say it. Michael stepped even closer, lowering his voice. "Emily, what happened to her? Where is she?" For the briefest moment, Daniel's eyes flickered with something raw, guilt, pain, maybe both. Then, just as quickly, he masked it. "I don't know." Michael's patience snapped. "That's a lie." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think you want the truth, but you don't. You never did. That's why you ended up here, Mike. That's why you lost everything." Michael staggered back as if he'd been slapped. His throat burned. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Daniel hesitated, running a hand through his graying hair before exhaling sharply. "I don't have the answers you're looking for," he said, his voice quieter now, almost regretful. "But I do know this, if you keep pushing, if you keep trying to find something that's been buried for a reason, you're going to regret it." Michael felt his entire body tense. His brother wasn't just warning him. He was pleading, like a man who had seen the edge of something dangerous and barely made it back. But Michael had already fallen. He was already too deep. "Then tell me one thing," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "The girl I saw today, the one who gave me this dollar." He held it up between them. "Was she—" His throat tightened. "Was she Emily?" Daniel's eyes darkened, his face unreadable. For a second, Michael thought he was about to say something to finally break. But instead, Daniel took a step back. "Don't come looking for me again, Mike." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing there, alone, the weight of the unanswered question pressing down on him like a vice. Emma sat in her bedroom, staring at the ceiling, her mind restless. The conversation with her grandfather earlier still lingered in her thoughts, stirring something she didn't quite understand. She had always trusted William without question, but tonight, there had been something in his voice, something in the way he had avoided her eyes, that unsettled her. She reached over to her nightstand and picked up her sketchbook, flipping through the pages. Most of them were filled with ballet sketches, pictures of her friends, small doodles of things that made her happy. But then, she stopped at a page near the back. A tiny face, drawn with the same simple lines she had put on the dollar. Her fingers brushed over it, confusion tightening her chest. She didn't remember drawing this, and yet the style was unmistakably hers. A quiet knock at her door made her snap the book shut. "Come in," she called, sitting up. William entered, his expression unreadable. He took a seat at the foot of her bed, his usual air of authority replaced by something softer. "Emma," he said after a long pause, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Emma frowned but nodded. "Okay. When you drew that face on the dollar today, why did you do it?" Emma blinked at him. "I don't know. I just felt like it." William studied her closely. "But why that specific face? Where did you learn it?" She hesitated, suddenly unsure. I don't know, Grandpa. It just came to me." A long silence stretched between them. Then William let out a quiet sigh, rubbing his temple. "I see." Emma's stomach twisted. "Grandpa, why are you asking me this? William forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No reason, darling. It's late. Get some sleep." But Emma wasn't convinced. Something was wrong. Something William wasn't telling her. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the truth. Michael spent the rest of the evening wandering the city, his mind buzzing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. His conversation with Daniel had left him with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: his brother knew something. And if Daniel knew, then someone else had to as well. He pulled his coat tighter around himself as he turned onto a quiet street. He needed a real lead, someone who could actually tell him what had happened all those years ago. Then, as if the universe had heard him, his gaze landed on a name he hadn't seen in over a decade. A small, dimly lit law office stood on the corner of the street, a weathered sign hanging above the door. Caldwell and Associates. Michael's breath caught. James Caldwell had been his family's lawyer. If there was anyone who still had access to records, to legal documents, to the past that had been wiped clean, it was him. Michael hesitated only a second before stepping forward, gripping the door handle and pushing inside. The office was nearly empty, save for a single lamp casting a dim glow over a desk covered in paperwork. An older man sat hunched over, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, muttering to himself as he flipped through files. Michael cleared his throat. "James." The man looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "I'm busy." Then his face went pale. He stood slowly, his hands shaking. "Michael Carter?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Michael nodded. "It's been a long time." James ran a hand through his thinning hair, his expression unreadable. "My God, we thought you were..." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "Dead." Michael finished for him. "Yeah, a lot of people did." He stepped forward, his voice firm. "I need answers, James. I need to know what happened. And I think you know more than you've ever admitted." James hesitated, glancing toward the office door as if someone might be listening. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You need to leave. Now." Michael's heart pounded. "Not until you tell me what I need to know." James exhaled shakily. "You don't understand. If they find out you're here..." "Who?" Michael demanded. James' gaze darted toward the window, fear creeping into his features. "You have no idea what you're up against, Michael. You should have stayed buried." Michael's blood ran cold. He had been right all along. There was something much bigger going on, and someone wanted him to stay lost. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears as he locked eyes with James Caldwell, the man who once handled his family's legal affairs. The dim light in the office cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel heavier, darker. The fear in James's face wasn't just hesitation. It was pure dread. That alone told Michael everything he needed to know. There was something dangerous about the truth. "You need to leave," James repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers trembled as he gathered the papers on his desk, avoiding Michael's gaze as though looking at him too long would invite trouble neither of them were prepared for. Michael didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what I need to know." James exhaled sharply, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to be watching. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Mike, you don't get it. You weren't supposed to come back. You were supposed to disappear." Michael's jaw clenched. "And yet, here I am." He took a step forward, voice firm. "Tell me about Emily." James visibly paled. "You can't be asking me this." Michael slammed his hand down on the desk, rattling the stack of legal documents. "I already lost everything once, James. I have nothing left to lose. So if you know something, now's the time to tell me before it's too late." James hesitated for a long moment. Then, after a quick glance at the door, he motioned for Michael to sit. Michael did, his heart pounding, waiting for the answer that had eluded him for years. James leaned in, lowering his voice. "I don't know everything. I was only involved in a small part of it." He hesitated. "But I do know that after your life fell apart, Emily didn't just disappear. She was placed somewhere, and someone made sure that the truth never saw the light of day." Michael's stomach twisted. Placed where? James hesitated again. I don't know exactly, but he rifled through one of his desk drawers, pulling out a thin, aged file. This is all I have left from the case. Everything else was erased. Michael's hands trembled as he took the file. He opened it, scanning the few remaining documents inside. Most of it was legal jargon, sealed court orders, adoption paperwork with key details blacked out. But there, at the bottom of the last page, was something that made his breath catch. A name. William Anderson. Michael's mind reeled. That was the man he saw with the little girl. The same man who had taken Emma's hand and led her away. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears. Who is William Anderson? James's face darkened. A very powerful man, and someone you don't want to cross. Michael clenched his jaw. I don't care who he is. If he has my daughter. James shook his head. Michael, listen to me. If you push too hard, if you start digging into this, they will come for you. And this time, they won't just take your daughter. They'll make sure you never surface again. Michael's chest tightened. Then I'll be careful. But I'm not walking away. He stood, gripping the file tightly. You said I was supposed to disappear. That I wasn't supposed to come back. He locked eyes with James. Well, I'm back. And I'm going to find her. James's expression was grim. Then God help you, Mike. Emma sat at the grand dining table, her hands resting lightly in her lap, but she wasn't really paying attention to the dinner in front of her. The house was always quiet at this hour, filled only with the soft clinking of silverware against plates and the occasional murmur from her grandfather. But tonight, the silence felt different. She stole a glance at William. His face was unreadable, his usual mask of calm and control firmly in place. But Emma knew him well enough to see the tension in the way he held his fork, the way his eyes seemed distant, distracted. She wanted to ask what was wrong. She wanted to know why he had asked her about the drawing on the dollar bill, why he had looked so troubled afterward. But she also knew better than to press when he wasn't ready to talk. Instead, she lowered her gaze and focused on her plate, pushing food around absent-mindedly. But the thoughts wouldn't leave her alone. Why had that man looked at her like that? Why did the face on the dollar feel so familiar? Michael stood outside the Anderson estate that night, his breath fogging in the cold air. The towering iron gates loomed before him, a stark reminder of just how impossible this task would be. He had no way in, no plan, no leverage. But he had determination. He watched from the shadows as a sleek black car pulled up the long driveway. The doors opened, and there she was, Emma. Michael's breath caught. She looked different from the little girl in his memories, but at the same time, she didn't. The same bright eyes, the same soft expression, the same way she twirled a strand of hair between her fingers when she was thinking. His daughter, his Emily. She was alive, safe, but she didn't know who he was. His chest ached with the weight of it. He wanted to call out to her, to tell her everything. But he knew it wasn't that simple. He had been erased from her life for a reason, and now he had to find a way back in, without getting caught. William sat alone in his study later that night, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk in front of him. His hands rested on an old letter, the paper worn from years of handling. If anything happens to me, please take care of her. Please, William. You're the only one I can trust. Michael Carter's handwriting. William exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He had kept his promise. He had raised Emma, given her a good life, shielded her from the truth. But now the past was creeping back. And if Michael had found her, if he was getting close, William's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't let that happen. He had to protect Emma, no matter the cost. Michael stood in the shadows, his mind racing. He had found her, but finding her wasn't enough. Now he had to figure out how to get her back. But as he turned to leave, he felt a presence behind him. A low voice spoke from the darkness. You shouldn't be here, Carter. Michael spun around, his breath catching as he saw a man step forward from the shadows. Someone who had been watching him. Someone who had been waiting. Michael's heart pounded. He wasn't the only one searching for the truth. And now someone was hunting him. Michael's breath hitched as he turned sharply, his muscles tensing at the sound of the voice behind him. The night air was thick with tension, the cold biting at his skin as he locked eyes with the man emerging from the shadows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the dim glow of the estate's security lights. But Michael didn't need to see him clearly to know that this man wasn't here by accident. "You shouldn't be here, Carter," the man repeated, his tone measured but firm, carrying the weight of something unspoken. Michael's pulse pounded. He had expected obstacles. He had expected resistance. But what he hadn't expected was someone who knew his name. "Who are you?" Michael's voice was low, cautious. The man didn't answer immediately. He took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm someone who knows how this story ends if you keep pushing," he said finally. "And trust me, you don't want to be around when it does." Michael clenched his fists, every muscle in his body screaming to demand answers, to fight back against the secrecy that had ruled his life for so long. But he forced himself to stay calm. He had to play this carefully. "Who sent you?" Michael asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The man smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "You already know the answer to that." Michael's stomach twisted. William Anderson, of course. The man who had raised his daughter as his own. The man who had built an empire on power and wealth. The man who had erased Michael from his own life. Michael exhaled slowly, keeping his voice level. "I just want to see her." The smirk disappeared. "That's not an option." Michael took a step forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "She's my daughter. She's not yours anymore." Michael's breath caught in his throat. The words cut deeper than he expected, sharper than any blade. He felt something primal stir inside him, something that had been buried beneath years of loss and regret. He wanted to scream that they were wrong, that Emily would always be his, no matter how much time had passed. But he swallowed the fire, forcing himself to think. He had to be smarter. "You can tell Anderson that I'm not going anywhere," Michael said, his voice tight. "He can try to keep me away, he can send his people, he can threaten me all he wants. But I'm not giving up." The man's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something almost like pity. "You think this is about threats?" He shook his head. "You don't understand what you're walking into, Carter. You never did." Michael's jaw tightened. "Then explain it to me." The man hesitated for the first time, as if considering something. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stepped even closer. "You want the truth?" he murmured. "Then start with your own past. The answers you're looking for aren't in that house. They're in the life you lost." Michael's pulse jumped. "What does that mean?" But the man didn't answer. He simply gave Michael one last look before stepping back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Michael stood frozen, his mind racing. Start with your own past. What was he missing? Emma lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing against her like an invisible weight. She turned onto her side, pulling her blankets tighter around her. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the man on the street, the way he had looked at her, the way her grandfather had reacted afterward. There was something wrong. She didn't know what, but she could feel it in her bones. She sat up slowly, glancing toward the door. The hall outside was dark, the rest of the house still. If she was going to find answers, now was her chance. Slipping out of bed, Emma moved carefully, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. She made her way down the hall, past the paintings and antique furniture, past the doors she had never been allowed to open. She stopped in front of her grandfather's office. The door was locked, as always, but Emma knew where he kept the key. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the small decorative box on the nearby shelf, lifting the lid and retrieving the cold metal key inside. Taking a deep breath, she slid it into the lock. Click. The door creaked open. Emma hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The office smelled of old books and polished wood, the scent familiar but suddenly foreign in the dim light. She moved toward the massive desk, her fingers grazing the stacks of papers, the neatly arranged books. And then she saw it. A locked drawer. Her pulse quickened. She had never seen her grandfather open this drawer. Not once. Which meant whatever was inside was important. Her fingers curled around the handle, tugging lightly. It didn't budge. Biting her lip, she scanned the desk, searching. And then there, a small key, tucked beneath a stack of documents. Emma's heart pounded as she picked it up, testing it against the lock. Click. The drawer slid open. Inside, there were several old letters yellowed with time, a few photographs, and a single, worn folder. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. And then she saw the name printed on the cover. Michael Carter. Emma's breath caught. She didn't recognize the name, but something told her she should. Michael sat in a small diner on the outskirts of town, a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. The words from the stranger at the Anderson estate kept replaying in his head. Start with your own past. He had spent so many years trying to survive, trying to move forward, that he had never truly looked back. Maybe that had been a mistake. He pulled out the folder James Caldwell had given him earlier that night, flipping through the documents again. And then, something caught his eye. A date. The date of his supposed disappearance. But there was something wrong with it. The official records claimed he had gone missing months after he remembered his life falling apart. But Michael knew that wasn't true. He remembered losing everything in a matter of weeks, which meant someone had altered the timeline. Someone had rewritten his history. His heart pounded. Who had done this? And why? Emma stared at the folder in her hands, her mind spinning. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the first page. It was a legal document. Something about guardianship. Her eyes trailed lower, and then she saw it. Her name, Emily Carter. Emma's stomach dropped. She wasn't Emma Anderson. She had never been. The room spun around her, the walls closing in. Her entire life had been a lie. Michael's hands tightened around the folder as realization hit him like a freight train. His past hadn't just been erased. It had been rewritten. And now he had proof. But the bigger question remained, who had done this? And what were they so desperate to hide? Emma's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she stared at the name printed on the document in front of her. Emily Carter. Not Emma Anderson. Not the name she had carried her entire life. But Emily. A name that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the rest of the file, scanning over pages of legal jargon she barely understood. But the pieces were forming something undeniable. She wasn't who she thought she was. The air in the office felt suffocating. Her heartbeat pounded so loudly she thought it might shake the walls. She felt like she was drowning in a reality she had never known existed. If her name wasn't Emma Anderson, if she was Emily Carter, then what did that mean? Who had lied to her? Who had taken her away from the life she was supposed to have? A memory flickered in the back of her mind. A song. A man's voice singing softly, lulling her to sleep. She didn't know where it came from, but the melody was as familiar as breathing. It was something that had always been there, buried beneath the life she had lived. And now it was clawing its way to the surface. Her stomach twisted as she carefully placed the folder back into the drawer, locking it with shaking hands. She had to pretend she hadn't seen it. Not yet. Not until she understood what this meant. She closed the office door quietly, slipping back into the hallway, her fingers still cold with shock. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. Michael sat in his motel room, the single bare light bulb above him flickering slightly as he stared at the papers spread across the bed. His mind was racing. His past had been altered, manipulated. But by who? And why? He flipped through document after document, scanning for something. Anything that would tell him where it had all gone wrong. Then he saw it. A sealed court order with a judge's signature. The document that had finalized Emily's adoption. But there was something strange about it. The ink on the signatures looked uneven, almost like Michael's breath caught. Forgery. Someone had altered the legal documents to make his disappearance look official, to make it seem like he had abandoned his daughter. His hands shook as he ran his fingers over the paper, realization hitting him like a freight train. This wasn't just about William Anderson taking Emily in. This was bigger. Someone had wanted him gone, and now he needed to know why. Emma stood outside her grandfather's study, watching as he poured himself a drink. His movements were slow, deliberate, but there was a tightness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. She took a breath. "Grandpa!" William turned, his face carefully composed, but his eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Emma, what are you doing up so late?" She hesitated. "I wanted to ask you something." William set his glass down, his expression patient. "Of course. What is it?" Emma swallowed. She had to be careful. If she confronted him too soon, he would shut her down, maybe even lie. She needed to get him to talk without realizing she already knew too much. "The man from the other day," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "The one I gave the $1 to. You knew him, didn't you?" William stiffened almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. "Emma," he said slowly, "why are you asking me this?" She hesitated. "Because he looked at me like he knew me. And you." She paused. "You looked at him the same way." Silence stretched between them. William's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. "You shouldn't dwell on things that don't concern you," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "The past is the past." Emma's chest tightened. "Is it?" William met her gaze, and for the first time in her life, she saw something in his eyes that scared her. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. Michael's heart pounded as he walked through the dimly lit streets, the file tucked securely inside his coat. He needed to find the missing link, the one person who could tell him what had really happened. And that meant going back to the one place he had avoided for years. His old home. The house where he had once lived with his wife and daughter. The house where everything had fallen apart. He didn't know if it was still standing, if someone else had moved in, if it had been left to rot. But he had to see it. He had to go back to where it all began. As he turned onto the familiar street, his breath caught. The house was still there, but something was wrong. The windows were dark, the front yard overgrown, the once pristine porch now worn and splintered. It looked abandoned, like a place frozen in time. Michael hesitated only a second before walking up the steps. He tried the door. Locked. He stepped back, glancing around. Then, carefully, he moved toward the side of the house, where an old window still sat slightly ajar. He pried it open and slipped inside. The air was thick with dust. The furniture was covered with white sheets, untouched for years. It was as if no one had lived here since the day he left. His chest ached as he stepped further inside, memories pressing down on him. And then he saw it, an old wooden box sitting on the mantel above the fireplace. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside there were letters, photographs, and a small bundle of drawings. Drawings of the same little face Emma had drawn on the dollar bill. Michael's vision blurred. She had never forgotten. Even after all these years, some part of her had held on to him. But before he could process the emotion rising in his chest, something else caught his eye. A note, scrawled in hurried handwriting. "If you're reading this, then it means I failed. They took her, but I never stopped fighting. Don't let them win. Find her." Michael's breath came in sharp gasps. His fingers tightened around the paper. This was written for him. Someone had tried to warn him. Someone had fought to keep Emily safe. And now it was his turn to finish what they started. Emma sat on her bed, her heart pounding. The weight of the folder she had stolen from her grandfather's office pressed against her lap. She needed to know more. She flipped to the last page, and her world shattered. There, attached to the final document, was a photograph of her. But she wasn't alone. A man was holding her, his arms wrapped protectively around her, his eyes full of love. She had never seen this picture before, and yet something deep inside her knew. This was her father, and he wasn't William Anderson. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the edges of the photograph. Everything was a lie. Her entire life had been built on something false. Tears burned in her eyes, but she forced them back. She had to find him. She had to find the man in the photograph. the man who had been erased from her life, her real father. Michael folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his coat. His mind was a storm of emotions. Grief, rage, determination. He wasn't going to let them keep her from him any longer. He had proof now, and soon Emma would know the truth. But as he turned to leave, something shifted in the shadows. Michael froze. Someone was watching him, and they weren't alone. Michael's breath hitched as the realization sank in. He wasn't alone. The shadows in the abandoned house stretched long against the dust-covered floors, flickering in the dim light filtering through the broken blinds. A presence lingered, just out of sight, watching. His fingers instinctively tightened around the old letter he had found, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. Whoever they were, they had been waiting for him. Slowly he turned, his body tense. "I know you're there," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Come out." Silence. Then, a shift. A faint creak of wood, deliberate but careful, like someone deciding whether or not to step forward. Michael swallowed hard, every nerve in his body screaming to run, to fight, to do something. But then, from the darkness near the staircase, a figure emerged. It was an older man, his face partially obscured by the low light. His hair was silvered with age, his suit slightly wrinkled as if he had been waiting there for a long time. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Michael's with something unreadable behind them. Michael's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The man exhaled slowly, slipping his hands into his pockets as he stepped closer. "Someone who knows more than you do, Carter." Michael's muscles coiled with tension. "That's not an answer." The man tilted his head slightly, studying him. "No, I suppose it's not. But if you're looking for the truth, you're already closer than you think." Michael's patience was running thin. He took a step forward. "If you know something, then tell me. Who took my daughter? Who changed my past?" The man sighed, as if this was a conversation he had been dreading. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said simply. "It's not just about who took her. It's about why." Michael felt his stomach twist. "Then tell me why." The man hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. A folded piece of paper. He held it out. "You'll find some of your answers here. But I warn you, Carter, some truths aren't easy to carry." Michael hesitated only a second before snatching the paper from his hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words, and the air left his lungs in a sharp exhale. A birth certificate, not Emily's, his own, and next to father's name. Instead of the man he had always believed to be his father, there was another name entirely. William Anderson. Michael's entire body went cold. His hands shook as he reread the document, his mind rejecting what he was seeing. This has to be fake. The man didn't move. "It's real." Michael's heart pounded, his vision blurring at the edges. No, that's not possible." The man's gaze remained steady. "And yet, here you are." Michael took a step back, shaking his head. "William Anderson is not my father. He's the man who took my daughter, the man who saved her." The man interrupted. His voice wasn't mocking, wasn't cruel. It was heavy, tired. At least, that's what he believed he was doing. Michael's breathing was uneven now. His entire life, every memory, every belief, was unraveling in front of him. "If this is true," he managed, his throat tight, "then why didn't he tell me? Why erase me from my own daughter's life?" The man was silent for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "Because you were never supposed to know." Michael's blood ran cold. Everything, the legal documents, the adoption, the sealed court orders, it hadn't just been about taking Emily away. It had been about removing him entirely, like he had never existed at all. Emma sat in her bedroom, staring at the photograph in her hands. The image of the man holding her, her real father, was burned into her mind. It felt like looking at a ghost, at someone she had known in another life but had been forced to forget. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. She needed to find him. Her fingers clenched around the photograph as she stood. Her grandfather was keeping secrets. That much was clear. And if he had lied about this, what else had he hidden from her? She had to leave. She had to get out of this house. Slipping on her jacket, she quietly opened her bedroom door, glancing down the hallway. The house was still, dark. Carefully, she made her way down the grand staircase, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. But as she reached the front door, a voice stopped her. Going somewhere? Emma froze, turning slowly. William stood at the base of the staircase, his expression unreadable. Her fingers tightened around the photograph. She hesitated, searching for an excuse, but she knew it was useless. William was too smart for that. His gaze dropped to her hands, and for the first time, his composure cracked. Where did you get that? Emma swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell me? William exhaled, rubbing his temple. Emma, listen to me. No. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. No more lies. No more secrets. Who is he? William was silent for a long time. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, as if he was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. You already know the answer. Emma's throat tightened. Michael Carter wasn't just some stranger on the street. He was her father. The truth settled over her like a crushing weight. Her entire life had been shaped by a lie, and the man she had trusted more than anyone had been the one to keep it from her. Tears burned in her eyes, but she held them back. I need to see him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. William's face darkened. That's not an option. Emma's hands trembled. You can't stop me. William's jaw tightened. I can, and I will. Emma felt something inside her crack. Why? Her voice broke. Why did you take me from him? William looked away. Because I had to. Emma's breath hitched. No, you didn't. William finally met her gaze, and for the first time in her life, she saw something in his eyes that terrified her. Guilt, regret, and something that looked a lot like sorrow. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. What did you do? A long silence stretched between them, and then, in a voice that barely reached her ears, William said, I made sure you would never remember him. Emma's world shattered. She took a step back, shaking her head. No. William closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. It was the only way to protect you. Emma's heart pounded. From what? William hesitated. Then finally he said, From the truth. Michael stood in the abandoned house, the weight of the birth certificate in his hands. His mind was a storm of confusion, anger, and disbelief. His entire life had been rewritten, his daughter stolen, his identity erased, and now there was only one thing left to do. He had to find her. He had to make her remember, even if it meant tearing down the life she thought she knew, even if it meant facing the truth neither of them were ready for. Because one way or another, he was getting his daughter back. Emma's mind felt like it was unraveling, every thread of her life coming undone at once. The air in the grand hall of the Anderson estate felt heavy, suffocating, as she stared at the man who had raised her, the man she had trusted more than anyone, her grandfather, or at least that's what she had always believed. But now she wasn't sure who he was at all. William stood rigid, his hands braced against the desk, his normally composed expression cracking at the edges. The weight of his own confession hung between them, thick and suffocating. I made sure you would never remember him. The words echoed in her mind, looping over and over until they became unbearable. Emma's breath shook as she took a step back. How could you? William exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples as if the weight of years of secrets was finally pressing down on him. Emma, please, just listen to me. Listen to you? Emma's voice rose, raw and broken. You've lied to me my entire life. You took my father away from me, and you want me to just, what? Accept it? His gaze flickered with something. Guilt, maybe even shame, but it was quickly buried beneath his usual stoic expression. I did what was necessary. Emma clenched her fists, trying to control the rage, the grief, the confusion swirling inside her like a hurricane. Necessary for who? For me or for you? William didn't answer right away, and the silence was worse than any words he could have spoken. Emma shook her head. You knew he was alive this entire time, and you let me believe. Her throat tightened. You let me believe I didn't have a father. William finally looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw something raw, something vulnerable in his eyes. You don't understand, Emma. If I had let him stay in your life, he would have destroyed you. Emma's heart pounded. That's not true. It is. William's voice was quiet but firm. Your father, Michael Carter. He was never meant to be part of your life. Emma felt the room tilt slightly, as if gravity itself had shifted. Why? William hesitated. Because he wasn't who you think he was. Emma's stomach twisted. Stop lying to me. I'm not lying, William said, his voice suddenly weary. I know you think I did this out of selfishness, but I didn't. I did it to protect you. Emma's eyes burned with unshed tears. Protect me from what? William's jaw tightened. From the truth. Emma inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. Then tell me the truth. William hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. If I do, you'll never see me the same way again. Emma's voice trembled. Maybe I don't want to. Silence. Then finally William spoke. Your father. He wasn't taken from you, Emma. He looked at her, his voice grave. He gave you up. The words hit like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. No, she whispered. You're lying. William sighed heavily. I wish I was. Emma shook her head, refusing to believe it. No, that doesn't make sense. If he gave me up, why would he be looking for me now? Because he changed his mind, William said simply. But it was too late. Emma's throat tightened. You're twisting this. You're making him into someone he's not. William studied her carefully. Am I? Emma swallowed hard, trying to push down the doubt creeping into her mind. I need to hear it from him. You can't. Emma's head snapped up. Why not? William hesitated. Because if you do, you won't know what to believe anymore. Emma's stomach churned. You don't get to make that choice for me. William exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Emma, listen to me. You think you know what you want, but you don't. If you go looking for him, if you open that door, you won't be able to close it again. Everything will change. Everything already has, Emma whispered. William's expression darkened, and for the first time, Emma saw fear in his eyes. Real fear, and that terrified her more than anything else. Michael sat alone in his motel room, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign outside his window. His hands trembled as he held the birth certificate, the truth staring back at him in cold, printed letters. William Anderson, his father. It didn't make sense. Couldn't be real. His whole life, he had believed that his parents had died when he was young, that he had been alone in the world except for his brother. But now everything had been rewritten. And worse, if William was his father, then that meant Emma wasn't just his daughter. She was his sister. Michael felt the breath leave his lungs. This changed everything. And yet, at the same time, it didn't change anything at all. She was still his daughter in every way that mattered. He had raised her, loved her, protected her. No piece of paper could take that away. But William, he had taken everything from him. Michael clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the birth certificate. He wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. But before he could fully process the storm of emotions inside him, his phone buzzed. A single text message. Unknown number. I know what you're looking for. Meet me at the old train station. Midnight. Come alone. Michael's heart pounded. Could be a trap. Or it could be the answers he had been searching for. Either way, he was going. Emma sat in her room, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. Her mind was a hurricane of emotions. Confusion, anger, betrayal. But through it all, one thing remained clear. She had to find him. She had to find Michael Carter. And if William wouldn't let her, Then she would do it on her own. She glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. She had overheard a phone call earlier, her grandfather speaking in hushed tones, mentioning something about an old train station. She didn't know if it meant anything, but she was willing to take the risk. She grabbed her coat, her heart hammering as she slipped out the back door. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew one thing for sure. She was finally going to meet the man who had been searching for her all along. Her real father. Michael stepped onto the train platform, the air thick with the scent of rust and old wood. The tracks stretched into the darkness, abandoned for years. He glanced around, his pulse steady but alert. Then, footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows. Michael tensed. "Who are you?" The person stepped closer, and when they spoke, Michael's blood ran cold. "You're not supposed to be here, Carter." Michael's stomach twisted. He knew that voice, and in that moment he realized everything he thought he knew was about to come crashing down. The air at the abandoned train station was thick with silence, the kind that wrapped around the skin like an invisible weight. Michael stood rigid, his breath controlled, his mind racing through every possibility of who could be standing in front of him. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until the dim yellow glow of the flickering street lamp illuminated their face. Michael's breath hitched. Daniel, his brother, the brother who had told him to stop looking, to let the past stay buried. The brother who had walked away from him when he needed him most. The brother who was now standing in front of him, his expression unreadable. "Daniel." Michael's voice came out hoarse, disbelief clawing at his throat. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face as if he had already played this moment over and over in his mind. "I warned you, Mike," he said quietly. "I told you to stop digging." Michael took a step forward, his chest tightening. "And you really thought I would?" His voice cracked slightly, years of frustration, grief, and betrayal bubbling beneath the surface. "You really thought I'd just let them take her? Let them erase me?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." Michael's voice echoed off the crumbling walls of the station. "Because right now, nothing makes sense. William Anderson is my father. I have a past that was rewritten. Emily was taken from me, and somehow you knew all of this. You knew. And you still let me rot in the streets while my daughter was being raised by the same man who did this to me." Daniel's face darkened. "It's not that simple." Michael let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "No, it never is. Is it?" Daniel hesitated for a long moment, his expression shadowed by something that looked like regret. "I wanted to tell you," he admitted finally, "but I couldn't." Michael's hands curled into fists. "Why?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "Because I made a deal." Michael's blood ran cold. "A deal?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I was given a choice, Mike. Either I help keep you away from Emily, or we both disappear." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. You did this?" Daniel's eyes were pained. "I didn't have a choice." Michael took another step closer, his entire body trembling with barely restrained emotion. "You always had a choice. You just didn't choose me." Daniel's face twisted with something like shame. "I thought I was saving you." Michael let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "You didn't save me. You abandoned me." A thick silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid over the years. Then, finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice lower, raw. "Do you think you were the only one who lost something, Mike?" He took a step forward, his expression hard. "Do you think I didn't fight for you? That I didn't try? You have no idea what I had to do to keep you alive." Michael's breath was shallow. "Then tell me." Daniel hesitated. Michael's hands shook. "Tell me the truth, damn it." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. Then, when he opened them again, he finally said it. "The accident," he murmured. "It wasn't an accident." Michael's stomach twisted violently. "What?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "The night your life fell apart. When you lost your job, when you lost Emily, when you were..." He hesitated. It was planned, Mike. Everything. They set you up. They made sure you had nothing left so that when the time came, you would be too broken to fight back. Michael's entire world tilted. He staggered back a step, his mind spinning. Who? His voice was barely a whisper. Daniel's gaze darkened. William Anderson. Michael's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. No, that doesn't make sense. Why would he? Because you were a liability? Daniel cut him off, his voice tight. He didn't just want Emily, Mike. He wanted you gone. You were never supposed to come back. Michael felt like the ground beneath him had shattered. His entire life. His suffering, his loss, his years of searching for answers. It had all been orchestrated. His voice shook. He destroyed me. Daniel swallowed hard. He thought he was protecting Emily. Michael let out a bitter laugh, running a shaky hand through his hair. By erasing me? Daniel didn't answer. Michael clenched his jaw. I need to see her. Daniel's face darkened. You can't. Michael's heart pounded. She deserves the truth. She's not ready. Michael's voice cracked. Neither was I. Daniel hesitated for a long moment, then sighed heavily. There's something else, he admitted. Something I never told you. Michael's throat tightened. What? Daniel's expression was grim. You were supposed to be dead. Michael's blood ran cold. What? Daniel exhaled. William made sure you wouldn't just lose everything, Mike. He made sure you wouldn't come back. The night you disappeared, they didn't just wipe your records. They made sure you were removed. Michael's body went rigid. Removed. Daniel looked away. They tried to kill you. Michael's breath caught in his throat. They were supposed to, Daniel continued, his voice heavy. But I stopped them. Michael's entire body trembled. You? Daniel met his gaze. I made a deal, Mike. Your life in exchange for Emily staying with William. Michael's chest tightened painfully. You let them take her. Daniel's expression was pained. I let them keep you alive. A heavy silence stretched between them, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. Michael's hands curled into fists. I need to fix this. Daniel's voice was quiet. You can't. Michael's jaw clenched. Watch me. Daniel sighed. You don't even know where she is. Michael met his gaze. Yes, I do. Daniel frowned. How? Michael took a deep breath. Because she's already looking for me. Emma clutched the photograph tightly in her hands as she hurried through the darkened streets, her heart pounding. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to keep moving. She needed to find him, her father, the man she had been told didn't exist, the man who had been erased from her life. She knew now, and she wasn't going to stop until she found him. But as she turned a corner, a car suddenly pulled up beside her, the headlights flashing. The back door swung open, and a familiar voice spoke. Get in, Emma. She froze, her breath catching as she turned to see who it was. Her grandfather, William Anderson, sat in the back seat, his expression unreadable. Come home, he said quietly. Emma's hands trembled, her heart pounded, and in that moment she had to make a choice. Go with him, or keep running toward the truth. She took a deep breath, and made her decision. Emma's heart pounded as she stood frozen on the dimly lit sidewalk, the glow of the car's headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. William sat in the back seat, his gaze steady, unreadable, as he watched her through the open door. The city around them felt eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. Come home, Emma? William repeated, his voice calm, almost gentle, but there was an urgency beneath it, a quiet plea masked in control. Emma's fingers curled around the photograph in her hands, her grip tightening as her mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get away, to keep searching for the truth. But then she looked at William, the man who had raised her, the man who had been her family, her protector, her only constant. He looked tired, older than she had ever seen him, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she had never noticed before. Fear. Not fear of losing control. Not fear of anger or defiance. Fear of losing her. Emma swallowed hard. Tell me the truth. William's expression didn't change, but she saw his fingers tighten against his knee. I already have. No, Emma said, her voice trembling but firm. You told me your version of the truth, but I want all of it. No more secrets. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, finally, William exhaled, his shoulders sagging ever so slightly. Get in the car, he said, quieter this time, and I'll tell you everything. Emma's pulse pounded. This was it. Her choice. Go with him and hear the truth on his terms, or keep running toward a father she had never known. She took a deep breath. Then slowly she stepped forward and got into the car. Michael ran through the empty streets, his breath ragged, his body moving on sheer adrenaline. He had seen the car, William's car. He had seen Emma hesitate, then step inside. He was too late. No, 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 he muttered under his breath, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He pushed himself faster, his feet pounding against the pavement. His mind was racing, desperate for a plan, for anything that could stop this before it was too late. He knew where they were going, and he knew this was his last chance. The car ride was suffocatingly silent. Emma sat rigid in the back seat, staring straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. William sat beside her, his hands resting on the cane between his knees, his posture straight, composed. The driver didn't speak. They were heading home. Home. The word felt foreign now. William finally broke the silence. You're making a mistake, Emma. She turned to him sharply. Am I? William's expression was calm, but there was something unspoken behind his eyes. You think you want the truth, he said carefully, but you don't understand what it will do to you. Emma's fingers dug into her palms. It's already done something to me. William sighed, rubbing his temple. Michael Carter is not the man you think he is. Emma's throat tightened. He's my father. William's lips pressed together. He's also a man who made choices that led to his own destruction. Emma narrowed her eyes. Or did you make those choices for him? William hesitated. Then, finally, he said, I gave him a way out. He didn't take it. Emma's stomach twisted. You erased him. William looked at her then, really looked at her. I saved you. Emma shook her head. No, you saved yourself. Silence. Then, softly, William said, maybe. The car slowed as they reached the estate. The iron gates opened silently, welcoming them back into the world she had always known. The world that had been built on a lie. Emma's heart pounded as she stared at the massive house, at the memories it held, at the life that had been carefully constructed for her. Felt different now. Wrong. As the car came to a stop, William turned to her one last time. You have a choice, Emma, he said quietly. You can walk away from this, leave the past where it belongs, or you can open a door that will change everything forever. Emma met his gaze, her hands trembling in her lap. And then, before she could speak, the front doors burst open, and Michael was there. Michael didn't stop to think. He didn't stop to breathe. He shoved past the stunned guards at the entrance, his chest heaving, his mind focused on only one thing. Emma. She was standing just outside the car, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. His daughter, his little girl. Michael's breath caught, the world slowing for just a moment as he took her in. Then he turned to William. You don't get to keep her from me anymore. William didn't flinch. You don't belong here. Michael clenched his jaw. Neither do you. Emma's voice was quiet but strong. Stop. Both men turned to her. Emma looked at William first. I want to hear it. All of it. William studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and the truth finally came out. Years ago, William Anderson had found out something that changed everything. Michael Carter wasn't just some man who had married into wealth. He was his son, an illegitimate son, born from an affair William had spent his entire life trying to bury. When Michael's mother died, William had been given a choice. Acknowledge him or let him fend for himself. He chose the latter, but fate had other plans. Years later, When Michael unknowingly married into a world he had been meant to stay far away from, William saw his carefully constructed empire starting to crack. And when Emily was born, it was clear. Michael had unknowingly built a family that tied him back to William forever. And that could not be allowed. So William orchestrated everything. The job loss, the financial ruin, the erased records, the lies. He had given Michael a choice, to walk away and leave Emily behind or lose everything. Michael had fought back, so William made sure he lost anyway. And then, when Emily was left vulnerable, he took her in, raised her as his own, rewrote her past, and made sure she would never remember the man who had fought for her. Until now, silence followed the confession. Michael's hands shook. Emma's breath hitched. William closed his eyes briefly, then exhaled. "I did what I thought was right." Michael's voice was raw. "You destroyed my life." William finally met his gaze. "And I protected hers." Emma's chest ached. She didn't know what to feel, what to believe. Then slowly she stepped forward. And for the first time in 10 years, she looked at Michael and spoke the words that changed everything. "Dad." Michael's breath caught. His hands trembled. Tears filled his eyes. Emma swallowed hard. "I remember you." And just like that, the past came rushing back. William watched as Emma stepped toward Michael, watched as years of lies unraveled in a single moment. He had won for so long, but now, finally, he had lost. And as Michael pulled Emma into a tight embrace, tears slipping down his face, William did the only thing he could do. He turned and walked away, because in the end, the truth had set them free.